Hello, welcome to the introduction to the New Testament, dubbed as the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is a 9-week module dealing with the different parts of the New Testament. And today we shall be taking up Matthew and Mark, part one of it, and then another part would be next week. And so on, you would see there on your schedule, October 23, Luke and Acts part 1, October 30, Luke Acts part 2, November 13, Johannine Writings part 1, November 20, Johannine Writings part 2, and 3 parts for the Pauline letters, November 27, December 4, and December 11. And as I was saying, today we shall be dealing with Matthew and Mark, but even before that, we would be introducing the New Testament, the Gospels, and then a little bit of introduction of Matthew and Mark. And we will deal with them in depth next week. That is, on October 16 for the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. So for today, I would be going through this, okay, to introduce you to the New Testament, not really in depth, but at least some of the things that we should know in studying the New Testament. And then also an introduction to the Gospels, as well as an introduction to Mark and an introduction to Matthew. The New Testament. What comes into your mind when you hear this term, the New Testament? Of course, when we speak of something new, there should be something that was there before. And in the Bible, there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. So today I shall be dealing with these topics in regard to this. What is the New Testament? How the first Christian books came to be written and preserved. Because after all, the first Christian literature to be written are the books of the New Testament. And then we have New Testament times, political, cultural, religious, and philosophical. Testament or covenant. And when we hear testament, we usually think about the last will and testament or an agreement. That's why it's also called covenant. So testament is God's special dealing with human beings. If we come to think about the Bible, and it could be similar or it could be synonymous with covenant, meaning agreement or pact, promising special help or blessings. And we see this word many times in Scripture. We see these covenants, and they're familiar to us. The Noahic covenant, God's covenant with Noah after the flood. And we also come to think about the covenant that God had with Abraham and also with David. Remember that conversation between Nathan, the prophet Nathan, and David, when David was planning to build a house for the Lord. And Nathan told him, no, it's not you who will build the house. You will not build me a house. Those are the words of the Lord to David. I will build you a house. And so we have the house of David, a promise made to him by the Lord. And that is a covenant. And then also, of course, the covenant of the Lord with Moses. And we see this in 2 passages in Exodus 19 and 34. And here, Israel became God's special people. It's very significant that this also appears in Deuteronomy. And when we read that book, maybe you've seen this in the past lessons that you've had, if you've attended the one given by Father Steve on the Old Testament. In the book of Deuteronomy, there's that covenant between the Lord and Moses, a covenant between two unequal parties. And if you see, in archaeologically speaking, you find that there are parallels of this among the writings of the ancient Near East, especially with regard to the Hittites, where they have these treaties, the suzerainty treaties. What are these? Treaties that are between unequal parties. One is the master, and then the other one is a slave. And when you compare it with the book of Deuteronomy, they are very much the same. And still, here in this, when we talk about Moses, in Exodus 34, we read, he said, I hereby make a covenant. Before all your people, I will perform marvels. These are the words of the Lord, such as have not been performed in all the earth or in any nation. But the first words stick to us. I hereby make a covenant. So it's a covenant between the Lord and Moses. When we hear about the New Testament, coming also to our mind is the new covenant in relation with something that has been there before, which is the old covenant. And in Jeremiah, we hear the words, the days are coming when I will make a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors. I will place my law within them and write it upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Underscored the words, a new covenant. What was the covenant before? The covenant with their ancestors. So the Lord is making this new covenant. It's so beautiful. I will place my law within them and write it upon their hearts. I will be their people and I'll be their God, and they shall be my people. Very much related to what we hear in the earlier covenants that the Lord has made with his people. This is a renewed one. And then all the accounts of the Eucharistic words at the Last Supper on the night before Jesus died have him relate the term New Covenant or New Testament to his blood. When we attend the Holy Mass, when we celebrate the Mass, we hear those words about the blood of the new and everlasting covenant. And so this one becomes alive in us, this term, covenant. But only in the 2nd century do we find evidence of Christians using the term New Covenant or New Testament for a body of their own writings. And this is perhaps where we should focus on, because this is where this is what we're talking about, the New Testament in scriptures. So New Testament for this body of writings that ultimately it's only in the new in the at this time, only in the 2nd century, that we begin using the term New Testament for a body of writings, Christian literature, ultimately leading to the use of the designation Old Testament for the scriptures of Israel. In fact, if we look at the Old Testament, that is the Hebrew Bible. That is what the Jews use as their scriptures, which they call Tanakh, which I think you have, you know, from your study of the Old Testament. Tanakh with the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, respectively, the law, and then Nevi'im, the prophets, and then Ketuvim, the writings. And that is their scriptures, which we have adopted as Old Testament. And so New Testament is for this new body of writings, those that we know now. And that is part of our scriptures, both the Old and the New Testament. Now, we look into how these books were written by Christians, the coming into being of these books, although I will not deal with this extensively, just to say how they began. And the first Christian books, they were written, preserved, and collected. We begin with the letters, and these are familiar to us. They're the first Christian literature of which we know. In the 50s, Paul produced the earliest surviving Christian documents. And what are they? 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Romans. But by the mid-60s, death had come to the most famous of the earlier generation. Who were these? Those who had known Jesus or who had seen the risen Jesus. And the death of that first generation of Christians contributed to the production of works of more permanent nature. Example, the Gospels, which we shall study in a little while. Now, the letters and epistles remained an important means of communication, but now they had a more universal or permanent tone. And therefore, many scholars conclude that later letters, Second Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, First and Second Timothy, and Titus, were written not by the first generation, those who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus or those who were there in his ministry, but in the names of those figures in order to preserve their spirit and authority. So they attributed them to Paul. And then after the year 70, post 70, there were the epistles attributed to Peter, James, and Jude, along with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And these particular writings eventually became known as Catholic or general epistles, that is, works addressed to the Church Universal. Now we go to the Gospels. That somewhere in the 60s or just after the year 70, the Gospel according to Mark was written, offering an account of Jesus's deeds and words and experiences stemming from the decades that separated Jesus from the evangelists colored this presentation. Relevance to Christian problems determined the selection of what was preserved from the Jesus tradition. And then the Gospels according to Matthew and to Luke, they were probably written 10 to 20 years after Mark. And they offer much more of the Jesus tradition, especially by way of sayings. That's to be drawn from a lost collection of sayings known as Q. And still another form of the Jesus tradition found expression in the fourth gospel, John. And that was written late, around 90 to 100 AD. And that's a form quite different from that of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And we will see that in the coming lessons. Now, despite the local colorings of all four canonical Gospels, their overall import was to preserve for the late first century readers, and indeed for those of all time, a memory of Jesus that did not perish when the eyewitnesses did. Very much like what happens in our life. If we do not want something to be forgotten, we write it, especially in those times when we do not have this luxury of our smartphones with cameras. Now, there's also another form that we see, and that is the Acts of the Apostles. It's bringing forward the story of Christianity beyond Jerusalem, and then Judea to Samaria, and even to the ends of the earth. And such a work envisions an enduring Christianity that needs to know its continuity with Jesus, Peter, and Paul, and to be certain that its development has not been haphazard, but guided by the Spirit received from Jesus. And then, of course, something that interests many people, the book of Revelation. It's representative of still another literary genre in the Christian writing of the post-70 period. This is what we call apocalyptic literature. And the apocalypse is from the Greek word, the noun meaning disclosure or revelation. That's why we can also call the book of Revelation the book of Apocalypse. And what do we see there? Persecution of God's people by the great world empires challenged the extent to which history is under control. Take note, this was at the time when it was written. And apocalyptic literature responds to this affront by visions that encompass what is happening in heaven and on earth. And so instead of frightening, Revelation gave Christians hope. It gave them assurance that despite their setbacks they had suffered, God would make them victorious. Now we see the origin of the New Testament and the preservation of the books. And there's a basic question. How did we come, or what was their criteria of determining whether these books should be included in that list. So first, there should be apostolic origin, whether real, like the letters of Paul, that he should be the one to have written the books, or putative, meaning it's reputed to be written by Paul, no? Whether even though it's not real, there's a pseudonym or there's a name attached to somebody who is authoritative. Like, for example, the letters of Peter, the letters of John, and then the Gospels, no, like Matthew, etc. Second, there should also be, okay, the importance of the addressed community, Christian communities. Were they important in those early times? Letter Paul to the Romans, for example. What is the standing of that community? Or, for example, the community for whom Mark wrote his gospel. So it's important. For whom is that book addressed? Because if you have established that, then you would say that, yeah, the letter itself is important. Or the third one, the third criterion is conformity with the rule of faith. It should be something that is orthodox in its teaching, that it teaches what Jesus has taught. And we know that from the preaching of the apostles. And is it consistent with what the apostles were teaching? And in fact, there are many, or there are those who claim to be gospels, for example, but they do not pass this. Why? Because their contents are not according to the rule of the faith. Now let's see the New Testament times. And one thing that we look at is first century AD. By the way, AD is Anno Domini, meaning in the year of the Lord. Sometimes we would see, even here, okay, in the lessons, that we see CE instead of AD. What is CE? The common era. And so what is the opposite of AD? That is BC, before Christ. But BCE is before the common era. And therefore, BCE is like BC, and then CE is like AD. Okay, let's see the political sphere. Okay, they were under the Roman Empire, and the Palestine, which was under the Roman Empire, was really flourishing. Okay, in terms of this great architecture. Of course, there was taxation. And you see this in the picture. This is Palestine under the Roman Empire. This is part of Caesarea Maritima. It's a Roman city. They built a Roman city at that part. And now you would see a lot of its ruins. You see a very beautiful port there. And this was built by Herod, King Herod, that historians would call Herod the Great because of his reputation as a builder. So we divide the first century into three. The first third, we see Jesus preaching and his ministry. And then the second third of the century, that's the oral Christian proclamation. And the third is the Gentile dominance in the Christian communities. And then that's where we find the composition of most of the New Testament works. And here we have a prelude that is 332 BC. And whom do we find? Alexander the Great. This has a lot of effect. Why? Because the known world was Hellenized. Okay, it became Greek, and the lingua franca was Greek because of that. So 323 to 175 BC, there was the dominance of Palestine by competing Hellenistic kings. So we have the Ptolemies from Egypt fighting it out with the Seleucids of Syria, and then the Tobiads from the Transjordan. Okay, and then early 3rd century BC, we find the production of the Septuagint. If you see this term, LXX, that is Septuagint. And that is the Greek version of the Bible that was propagated all over the Greek-speaking areas. So outside Palestine, no? Even Egypt, for example. So we have leaders, Greek leaders like Antiochus III, and then Seleucus IV, and then Heliodorus, and then Antiochus Epiphanes, who reigned from 175 to 63 BC. He is Antiochus Epiphanes, who was there, okay, the one who figured out in the Maccabean revolt. And it's in those years that we see that revolt. And then the time of the Hasmonean high priests. So this is Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. He was for the unity of the whole empire. And so how did he do that? The same Greek culture and religion all throughout, that it was forced upon all those who inhabited the empire, including those in Palestine. And therefore, you find in the book of Maccabees a martyrdom of so many people who did not want to be Hellenized because they wanted to be steadfast in their faith. And then we find Mattathias, the priest who led the Jewish revolt of 167. And he had his brothers also, Judas Maccabeus, Jonathan, and Simon. Okay, these were his sons. Okay, and at that time also there was a key Jewish victory in 164 when Jerusalem was retaken, because it was under the Greeks, and then it was retaken from the revolt, and the site of the altar was purified and rededicated. And so from that time they were celebrating the Hanukkah. If you go to Jerusalem or to Israel or maybe any Jewish place at about Christmas time, when we Christians have the lights, it was also bright in their realm. Why? It was around that time, it is around the Christmas time, that the Jews celebrate their Hanukkah. And so we have other leaders under from the side of the Jews: John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Alexander Jannaeus, Salome Alexandria. You see the years there. And then until Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. But they were fighting for who would be leading, until there was one who took that opportunity to rule. And who was that? That was Pompey. Okay. In 63 BC, the Roman leader Pompey conquered, or he subjugated, he took advantage of that and then subjugated this part of Palestine. So from 63 to 4 BC, okay, from 63 BC, there was the Roman rule and Roman dominance. So you have, on the part of the Jews, you have Herod the Great, and then towards the end of the 63 to 4 also, we have Augustus. Okay, so those were the leaders. That's why in the Gospel of Luke, you see that. We'll take that up, okay, that they name also the leaders of the empire. Now we have Herod the Great, and we know him now from scriptures that he was the king of the Jews at the time of the birth of Jesus. And we hear his name in scriptures. And he was also called the Great, not by the Bible, but by extra biblical sources. Why? He was a builder. He built beautiful edifices all around the empire. So we have Caesarea Maritima. These are the ruins that continue to stand. I took this picture when we went there. And then we have Samaria, ruins also. And before, just imagine this was a Roman city. And then Machaerus, Herod built a palace there, and that was where John the Baptist was executed. I took this also when we went to Machaerus. Those columns continue to stand. And of course, if you visit Jerusalem and you find yourself at the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, that was part of the wall of the temple built by Herod the Great. Okay. Now, from the part of the Romans, we have Augustus Caesar or Octavian, and he was called Savior of the world. Imagine, be Savior of the world for Jesus. And this was also the title given to the emperor at that time. So it is something that the first Christians were using, and at the same time they are aware that it's also for the emperor. So that's the first third. Jesus was born before the death of Herod the Great, 4 BC. And then after Herod's death, Augustus split Palestine among the three of Herod's sons, Archelaus, the ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, and then Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee and part of the Transjordan. Now we also have Tiberius as one of the emperors. So after Augustus, there was Tiberius. And according to the historian Tacitus, he said things were quiet under the reign of this emperor. And of course, you know, Pontius Pilate, portrayed very kindly by the Gospels, pronouncing Jesus to be innocent. But actually, if you read extra biblical sources, you would find that Pontius Pilate was ruthless. And maybe you would not so much recognize a description of his if all that you've known about him is from the Gospels. And then another emperor, the third one, after Augustus, there was Caligula. And that time, 41 to 44, the one who was ruling among the family of Herod was Herod Agrippa. And after his death, another period of Roman rule. Okay. And you find Nero also ruling the Roman Empire. It was in his time when Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome. Now, the last third of the first century, we find the Flavian family of emperors who were ruling from 69 to 96. So Nero committed suicide, and therefore another emperor succeeded him. That was Vespasian, and his attention was focused on Rome. And so Titus was the commander at that time. And Titus, it was under the leadership of Titus where that Jerusalem was sacked and the temple destroyed in 70 AD. Okay, so you see this this arch in Rome. This is called the Arch of Titus. If ever you go to Rome, go to the Roman Forum, look for this. And here inside, you will find at this side, just at this side, okay, where I'm pointing at, okay, this where the cursor is, at the left side of this arch, you will find this. And what is this? It's the procession. Since arches are supposed to be trophies of emperors or generals, then they depict their important acts. And this is one important act, the sack of Jerusalem. You would know that it was Jerusalem that they sacked because you find the menorah from the temple here, okay? They are bearing the menorah. And if you go to the Museum of Israel, of the diaspora of the Jews in Tel Aviv, Israel, you would find this among the first things at the start of the tour, museum tour. It's actually it's a reconstruction, of course, and much of it is very faithful since it's very clear, okay, from the Arch of Titus. It's a reconstruction, and you would find these Roman soldiers bearing the menorah, plus among other things, these spoils of war from their sack of Jerusalem. So you have there Vespasian, 69 to 79, and then Titus, who was the one commanding those forces at the sack of Jerusalem. He became the emperor from 79 to 81. And then you have Domitian, 81 to 96, where there was a lot of persecution. Okay. Now at that time, Antioch, Ephesus, and Rome, okay, became Christian centers, more important than Jerusalem. And this may be because the number of Gentile Christians have surpassed the number of Jewish Christians. Okay. And then 98 to 117, you have Trajan. Okay, the persecution of Christians in Asia Minor, what you call now Turkey. And then in 117 to 138, Hadrian, a shrine in Jerusalem for Jupiter. Imagine the holy city, and then there's a shrine for that pagan god. Okay. Now, we also will tackle the social aspects of the New Testament times. So who were there? The Jews. The first believers of Jesus were Jews. And perhaps all New Testament authors were Jews. Okay, if you look at all those, of all the writings, okay, and so Judaism, okay, the first Christians did not sever themselves from the group who were going to the synagogues. They were still part of it. They remained Jews, but Jews who believed in Jesus Christ. And the Greek world, you we have the Greeks, okay? The world was Greek. And so we refer to it as the Hellenistic world. And majority of the world's Jews spoke Greek. Imagine, even the cross of on the cross, the inscription, one of the languages there was Greek. And then the biblical books were translated in Greek. And some were composed even in Greek, even those of the Old Testament. Like, for example, the Book of Wisdom. Now, Roman. It's Rome that was then in power. And there was the Roman system of roads. That's one of the things that they really contributed. That's why we have the expression, all roads lead to Rome. If we look at that, because they also built a lot of roads. And then the form of administration was Roman. You will see that also in the gospel, where the people were taxed. And then Caesar was there at the head. And then citizenship, a very important aspect. You are respectable among the Romans if you are a Roman citizen, like Paul was a Roman citizen. And then you have the associations or clubs. We have what you call the gymnasia. Now, the modern version are gymnasia, okay, our gyms. And then we have the guilds of profession and trade. So you have now Writers Guild, okay, and then the Masonic Guild of the medieval times and Renaissance times. The guilds, those who have the same profession, they flock together and then they form these groups. And there were also religious associations. There were also clubs for the young and the elderly. And then we see that the Jews in those times now, they were alienated by their religion. There was discrimination, and anti-Judaism was common in the empire. And there was a time that they were even expelled. And if this is true for the Jews, more so for the Christians were considered more dangerous to society than Jews. And we find this opposition expressed in Acts 28:22. As for this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. Now, for the Roman rule, there were the free cities, there were the colonia, and there was taxation, and there was wealth and poverty in society. And there were slaves called doulos. As for education, maybe we could ask whether they were really institutions. There was Greek schooling, elementary, grammar, upper level education, which continued to persist even in our times. And there was little evidence that Greek schools were widespread in Palestine. Now, for the religious aspect in the New Testament times, we find in the Jewish world the institution of the temple. Much of it we would explain throughout this course. And then also the synagogue. What you see there is the 3rd century synagogue built in Capernaum, perhaps the spot where Jesus himself was preaching. It's surrounded by the houses, the ruins of the different houses. And then you know this very well, that in the Jewish religious world, there were these groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees were the party of the high priests, aristocratic families, and merchants, and the wealthier elements of the population. And they came under the influence of Hellenism. They tended to have good relations with the Roman rulers of Palestine and generally represented the conservative view within Judaism. And then we have the Essenes, a mystic Jewish sect during the Second Temple period. that flourished from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. And they lived in communities scattered across biblical Judea and were known for their sharp asceticism and dedication. So this was supposed to be Pharisees, okay? The Pharisees were a social movement and a school of thought in the Levant during the time of the Second Temple Judaism. And after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Pharisaic beliefs became the foundational, liturgical, and ritualistic basis for rabbinic Judaism. And their very name, Pharisee, implies separation. Probably, this results from the fact that they too ultimately became critical of and split from the Hasmonean descendants of the Maccabees, who became increasingly secularized rulers. And the Pharisees' approach to the written law of Moses was marked by a theory of a second oral law, and supposedly also derived from Moses. And their interpretations were less severe than those of the Essenes, but more innovative than those of the Sadducees, who were really conservatively restricted to the writings of Moses. Now let's go to the post-biblical literature. We have the Targums. You might encounter these words one time or another. These were Aramaic translations of the biblical books as early as 70 AD to 2nd century AD. And then the Midrash, free commentaries on the book of the Torah. So we have the narratives of the Torah, and then there are commentaries full of other stories that are interspersed with it. And then Mishnah, the written codification in Hebrew of the Jewish oral law, the Tosefta, and that is a collection of laws and comments, and then the Palestinian Talmud and Babylonian Talmud. And these are commentaries written in Aramaic on the Mishnah. So this is post-biblical Jewish literature. And then in the non-Jewish world, we have the gods and goddesses of classical mythology, emperor worship, mystery religions, Eastern religions. If the studies in depth, we would be tackling each one of these in detail. Now, philosophically, they were influenced by Platonism, by Epicureanism, by Stoicism, and then also by the Sophists. And one very important philosopher who was Jewish was Philo. And of course, Gnosticism entered their realm also. What is it? The belief that human beings contained a spark of the divine, a piece of God, okay, within themselves. And that has fallen from the immaterial world into the bodies of humans. And all physical matter is subject to decay, rotting, and death. And the important thing is to have this secret knowledge. That's the teaching of the Gnostics. And in fact, you see that many of their teachings are somehow influenced by the Gospel of John, such that when you read the Gospel of John, you would ask, is it Gnostic? But it's the other way around. It is the interpretation, the extreme interpretation of the Gospel of John that has led to Gnosticism. And now we go to the introduction to these Gospels. I'd like to talk to you about Gospel and Gospels, the stages of the formation of the Gospels, and how did the Gospels come to be written, and then the synoptic problem. First, Gospel, what is Gospel, and the Gospels. When the closest thing to the Gospel or to the Gospels is actually the Hebrew word bashar. Here's the Hebrew word coming from right to left, bashar. Here's a transcription, and there's a translation. What is it? Good tidings, good news. Like the birth of a king's son, Jeremiah 20, bestowal of his throne name, and then especially victory in battle, and the proclamation of Yahweh's salvation and sovereignty. We see this in Bashar. And then we also have the good news, okay? That is from the Greek, okay? The Greek word for that we see in the Gospels is evangelion. Evangelion. What's the meaning? A reward for bringing of good news. And soon this was applied to the very announcement of itself. It's not only the reward, but it's a very good news. And often this news was connected to imperial cult. For example, inauguration of the emperor's reign, or his appearance after a battle, or in the case of Augustus, his birthday. That was good news. Now, in scriptures, we also see that St. Paul speaks about the gospel. And what is it? Christ's victory in battle, the saving action of God brought about through Jesus, his son, especially Romans 1:17, Ephesians 3, 1 Thessalonians 2. Now, what is this good news? The good news of the redemptive passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That became the earliest Christian proclamation, that good news. And it's also called kerygma, 1 Corinthians 15. It became the core and center of all Christian testimony, the pronouncement, the kerygma. Now, here's an expression of that from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and that in the same way, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Christ. We see three stages in the formation of the Gospels, okay? So first of all, we find it in the life and teachings of Jesus. That's the first stage. Jesus moving around, living, preaching, and this is from Dei Verbum, and the reference to the Acts of the Apostles. Actually, it's from all of these are expressed by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, of course, basing itself on Dei Verbum, the Vatican Council document on divine revelation. So the life and teaching of Jesus. And then after that, when Jesus had been taken up to heaven, the oral tradition, okay? What came after the preaching of Jesus and his moving about on earth? It's the apostles handing it down to those who heard, okay? So the preaching. In fact, the first one is the first third of the gospel of the year of the century, first century AD. The second one, this is the second third, approximately. And then, so there's the preaching, and then afterwards, the written gospels. So the gospels were written afterwards. So we find these three stages. So life and teaching of Jesus, and then the preaching of all of these, the oral tradition, and then it did not remain just oral, it was put down into writing, and so we have the written gospels. Now, how did the gospels come to be written? Okay, we have one of the models, the evolutionary model. So the Gospel of Mark, okay, the Gospel is a unique literary genre resulting from the earliest preaching of the church, and we find that in Mark, that Mark actually based it on that preaching. And so what was the first thing in the Gospels? The passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So that's the first part. It's actually the last part of the Gospels that we have now. And then later on, they thought of putting in the public ministry. So it's an expansion of the passion, death, and resurrection narrative. According to John, the account of John the Baptist and proofs of fulfilled predictions. So you find it there. And then they also put in material to support the cult of Christian sacraments. And then miracle stories in order to prove the authority of Jesus. And then pronouncement stories, the brief narrative that culminate in a saying of Jesus. And then sayings of Jesus to present Jesus as a teacher. And then finally, exhortations and congregational regulations. Such regulations have to be accounted for in the life of Jesus. And so they added that. So for most of the Gospels, or for all of the four canonical Gospels, you have that from the time of John the Baptist's ministry, and then the passion and death and resurrection of Jesus. And then there were added these, especially in Luke and Matthew, the birth or infancy narratives. And this is our conclusion, that there's one kerygma, a distinct Christian proclamation. The decisive role of the Christian community also was there in the selection of the material and in the formulation of the gospel. Take note of this now. There's a lot of material, but then can you put all those in one work? Let's take an analogy. We have the photo album. You have a lot of pictures. Will you place all of them in the photo album? What will be your basis what you place in the photo album? Maybe chronologically, maybe I put the solo pictures first and then the group pictures, or that's called conceptually. So it depends on you. It's at the back of your mind. What is your philosophy for putting this together? The same thing is true. There are a lot of materials, and it's in the mind of the one writing the gospel, putting them together according to his theology. What would be his aim in putting this into writing, into including it or not? Okay. So first in the selection of the material, and then in the formulation of the gospel. It's the Christian community doing that. And then lastly, the distinction of Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. From what is written right now, which one is really from the Lord? What did Jesus really do? Is everything in the Gospels really historically, is what did it historically happen? Okay, which were the very words of Jesus? The Our Father, the whole of Our Father, are all those the words of Jesus? Questions like that. So Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Okay, now I'm going to give you a problem, and this is called the synoptic problem. What is the synoptic problem? Okay, so you have the different evangelists, the three who are called the uh, synoptic evangelists, or those who wrote the synoptic gospels: Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the one on the right, you don't need to see whether what's that, if you're able to read it or not. But it's just putting them together. Like the first column is Matthew's gospel, the second is Mark's, and the third is Luke. And what are they? They are the common points among the three. Okay, so just to show you that there's a lot of material that is common, including what you see right now. If you compare Matthew 8:14 to 15, Mark 1:29 to 31, and Luke 4:38 to 39, and you put them together and you see this. They're very much the same. This is just one portion, and they agree on many things. Of course, there are differences, but then they agree on many things. So that leads also this one about the sower. A lot of similarities. Now, this is the problem, okay? In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there's a common material and order. And there is a common differences when compared, there are common differences when compared to the Gospel of John. And so clearly, they are in some relationship to each other. So what is this problem all about? The synoptic problem is the quest to discover the nature of that relationship. The term synoptic comes from Johann Jakob Griesbach, okay, in 1776, because he published a work called Synopse. And what is that? The parallel texts of the first three Gospels, they were printed beside one another for comparison. In fact, there are books like that putting together the three Gospels. And synopsis, the meaning of that is to view at the same time. Like, for example, if you want to look at parallels, Mark 1:16 to 20 is parallel to Matthew 18:22, and then Luke 5:1 to 11, the call of the first disciples. Just do that on your own and look at the similarities, okay? Now, there are agreements among the three Gospels. For example, the elements of the Gospel story arranged in the same order, using the same literary form, and Old Testament citations. You look at other parallels there, the calming of the storm, the Gerasene demoniac, daughter of Jairus, they all figure in the three Gospels. So let's see, elements of the Gospel story by section. So you see that these are four main parts of the Gospels: preparation to the ministry, ministry in Galilee, journey to Jerusalem, and passion and resurrection of Jesus. In Mark, you find it in preparation 1 to 13. Matthew, there's a corresponding section in Matthew, and in Luke. Ministry in Galilee, each of them have that correspondingly. And then the journey to Jerusalem, just look at this, okay? In Mark, it's a whole chapter. In Matthew, it's a bit longer, 19, the whole chapter of 19, and then 20 also, almost the whole chapter. And then in Luke, you find how many chapters? 9 to 18, okay? So about 10 chapters. Passion and Resurrection, each of them have three chapters each. Although you would include Passion and Resurrection, the ministry in Jerusalem. See that? That's why it's quite long for each of them. But they have all those sections. Now, there are also details that are alike. And so look at them. Baptism, each of them has this. Controversies with opponents. Multiplication of the loaves is present in not only the synoptics, but even in John. The confession of Peter, the foretelling of the passion, the last days of Jerusalem, the arrest, the judgment, and the death of the Savior. You find them all in this in the three Gospels. And so we could compare them. So what is the material common in all the synoptic Gospels? See this. Matthew, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and then you have the total verses. The shortest is Mark, 661. The longest is Luke, 1149, and then in between there's Matthew. Now, what are the proper verses? What do you mean by proper verses? What are the verses that you find in each gospel that you do not find in the others? For Mark, 30 proper verses. Matthew, 230. Luke, 548 that you don't find in the other two. Now, shared with the other two, for Mark, you have over 600 verses that he shares with the other two. Matthew, you don't find it here, okay? Because these ones are shared with Matthew and Luke, okay? The ones of Mark. But let's look beyond that. Shared with Mark, okay? Of course, you don't find that in Mark. Shared with the other two, so Matthew and Luke are not included. Shared with Mark, okay, Matthew, 80% of Mark is in Matthew. And then 65% of Mark is in Luke. Now, shared with Matthew. In Mark, of course, this is the same, 530, like this, 80%. And then, how about Luke? 235 verses he shares with Matthew. So that means Matthew and Luke share something that Mark does not have. Shared with Luke, Matthew, about 235. So the same thing. This is the same thing. And then shared with Luke, 65%. This one, okay, on the column of shared with Mark and Luke, and that there. And then in Mark and Luke, and not Mark, so Matthew and Luke share 220 verses that are alike. You see, when you are a teacher, and then you find among your students something very similar, then you would conclude there was something. There was academic dishonesty. Okay? There was copying. So if you find the three gospels very much alike, you would conclude that. Okay, and this is the problem, the synoptic problem, all about. Okay. Now let's see. Elements arranged in the same order. That episodes follow one another and are linked in an identical manner. So see, very similar. Paralytic of Capernaum, call of Levi, question of fasting. See, they are together in the three. The coming of the storm, the monarch of Gerasa, daughter of Jairus, they are together in the three Gospels. Confession of Peter, cure of an epileptic, second prediction of passion, they come one after the other in the same way in the three Gospels. Literary form, expression almost identical. What is the difference among them? The differences of style and vocabulary are insignificant. Maybe they just change it a bit, but they're not very substantive or substantial. Old Testament quotes, there's a perfect agreement in the form of Old Testament quotes, and you find them there. This I will not elaborate, but you see there the passages. Now, there are also disagreements. First, with regard to the sayings of Jesus, okay, and then elements of the gospel story, order of events and discourses, and then in the Passion and Resurrection, there are also some differences noticeable, where the most similar block of material, which are the most similar block of material in the synoptics. And so you find, example, in the sayings of Jesus, the Lord's Prayer, there's some differences in the Lord's Prayer from Matthew, which we have adopted for the Lord's Prayer. And then in Luke, you find it a bit different, okay? Very similar, but there are differences. Institution of the Eucharist, differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay. And then elements of the gospel story, the differences. Only in Matthew and Luke do we find birth and infancy narratives, and they are different from each other. Only Mark has the parable of the seed growing secretly. Only in Matthew do we find the parable of the weeds, the hidden treasure, the precious pearl, the leaven, the net, the unjust steward. Only in Luke do we find the parable of the prodigal son, of the good Samaritan, of the Pharisee and the publican, of the rich man and Lazarus. So that is of their own. So little by little, you see something that we would find in the end, that where we would conclude. Order of events also in discourses, okay? The order, for example, Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 to 7. In Mark, you don't have it. In Luke, he distributes the material into different chapters. The one of Luke, for example, there's an independent writing there, material, which you don't find in Mark and Matthew. And that is from chapter 9:51 to 18:14. And so you don't find that in the other two. Okay? And then Luke is in accord with Mark in the following, in 4:31 to 6:19, 4 to 9:50, and then 18:15 to 21, and 38. So you see that? Okay. Now, also Passion and Resurrection accounts. The words of Jesus on the cross are different. In the Siete Palabras, you would note that. Not all of them are seen in all the Gospels, in each of the Gospels. And then the appearances in Matthew and Mark in Galilee. In Luke, only in Jerusalem. In Matthew alone, do we find it mentioned the guards at the tomb. And then Luke alone mentions the disciples of Emmaus. We will see more of these when we tackle the different Gospels. But even, for example, what was hung on the cross, the sign, Matthew, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Mark, the King of the Jews. Luke, this is the King of the Jews. See? Differences. So, how could we solve this problem, the synoptic problem? So we have the oral tradition theory, okay, the Augustinian hypothesis, two gospel hypotheses, the priority of Mark, and the two source theory or two documentary theory. Okay. I will not dwell so much into detail with these first ones. Oral tradition theory is there is an oral tradition. And then there's one oral tradition. And from that one oral tradition, Matthew wrote his gospel, Mark wrote his gospel, and Luke wrote his gospel, all flowing from oral tradition. But the problem here is it cannot explain similarities. Why? Because there are verbatim agreements in the Greek edition. If I show you, for example, or if I let you listen to something, and then you would write it down, there will be differences among the versions that you will be writing. But here there are verbatim agreements. Okay? And you would find the examples there. Look at, for example, the last one, Matthew 9:6, Mark 2:10, and Luke 5:24. He said to the paralytic, and then that's the break that he puts in the unfinished sentence. And you would find that in all in the three accounts. But how come that it's like that? How come they're able to break it at the same time, and putting the same phrase? Augustinian hypothesis. So St. Augustine would say that, yeah, Matthew is the first gospel to be written, supporting many previous fathers of the church. And then Mark followed, okay? Mark copied the one of Matthew, and Mark abridged it. That's why it is shorter. And then Luke followed from Mark. So it's according to the usage of the church. It took Matthew as a catechetical gospel. Why is Matthew first? Because in tradition, they were saying it was the first. But then this theory somehow does not follow that, okay? Or the theory that we are about to see in the next, after this two gospel hypothesis. So here, the Griesbach hypothesis, two gospel, that's by Johann Jakob Griesbach, okay? That Matthew was the first to be written for the Palestinian Jewish Christians. And then Luke Acts used Matthew as the main source for Paul's mission to the Gentiles. And then Mark had a selective combination of Matthew and Luke to reconcile the Jewish and Gentile branches of Christianity. And then we have the Markan priority. Okay, so we have from Streeter, Weisse, and Holtzman that the contents of the Gospel of Mark also appear in Matthew and Luke. Frequently, Lectio Brevior. What is Lectio Brevior? A shorter reading. Okay, a shorter reading. So you have Mark, the version of Mark, and then when Matthew and Luke copies from Mark, their version is always shorter. Now, these are the reasons why they hold that Mark came first. Okay. One, both Matthew and Luke share a common subject matter with Mark. Okay. And then to a large extent, Matthew and Luke share a common wording with Mark, often repeating exact words. And they say that Matthew copies 51% exactly, and then Luke 53 of Mark. Matthew and Luke generally follow Mark's arrangement at the sequence or order of events. Now, when there are deviations in Matthew from Mark or in Luke from Mark, these are relatively small in number, and they can be quite easily explained as due to the redactional activity of Matthew and Luke. And competing hypotheses fail to explain the order of the gospel so well that whenever Matthew departs from Mark's order, Luke supports Mark. Whenever Luke departs from Mark's order, Matthew supports Mark. And then with regard to the great omission, that Luke did not copy a great part from Mark, okay, there's a difficult, it's very difficult to find a convincing reason why he does that. Now, here are some difficulties when we put in the Markan priority. What is that? The presence of duplicate expressions in Mark. For example, Mark 1:32, evening has come, sun was setting. Why is that so? Why is there a duplicate there? Is that Hebrew parallelism? And then there's the minor agreements at the level of the detailed wording. At times, Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. So how is that? Okay. Example, Matthew 17:17 and Luke 9:41. Oh, faithless and perverted generation. In Mark, you don't have perverted. Why is it that in Matthew and Luke you have it? Luke 22:64 and Matthew 26:68. Remember the Passion of Christ? They were playing, who hit you? Okay, prophet. There, in Luke and Matthew, prophesy, or in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, prophesy. You see that. But then in Luke and Matthew, you find prophesy, who hit you. Why is that not in Mark? Okay, here's what I was telling you about. Mark does not have and perverse. Okay, of course, it's in the Greek, in the original. And then Mark only says prophesy. Matthew and Luke prophesy. Who is it that struck you? So that is some kind of a problem. But then now, there's a proposal, further proposal to the Markan priority. They added something, okay? So the contents of the Gospel of Mark also appear in Matthew and Luke, frequently Lectio Brevior. But then why are there common elements between Matthew and Luke? Okay, so here's the synoptic problem. Again, Gospel of Mark. Matthew copied from Mark. Luke copied from Mark. But why is it that there are similarities between Matthew and Luke? Therefore, there was another source that they copied from, which is not Mark. Okay, it's the probability of the Q source. It's hypothetical. Okay, so Matthew and Luke have common material, which is not found in Mark, and that's 250 verses. And many of these are sayings of Jesus. That's why here's the hypothesis. There could have been a work which was mainly sayings of Jesus. And probably it's a manual of instruction written around 50 AD, around the time when First Thessalonians was written. So how is it? Okay, so Gospel of Mark, Matthew copied, and then and then there's that Quelle, or saying source. Quelle is the German for source. So the Q source. So from the Q source, Matthew got from that, Luke got from that. Now, there are some things that are in Matthew that are not in Mark and in Luke. So we may call them special Matthean or special Matt or M source. Like what? Infancy narratives, Peter walking on the water, the fate of Judas, Pilate washing his hands. They're M source. So we have that M or special Matthean source. Now, what about Luke? There are so many things that Luke wrote that are not in Matthew and in, of course, that are not in Matthew and definitely not in Mark. So there are special Lucan sources, special Luke or L source, like the journey narratives, the sermon at Nazareth at the beginning of his ministry, and the penitent woman, and Emmaus, Good Samaritan, prodigal son, Pharisee and tax collector. Let's call them the L source. And that is it, okay? L or special Lucan source, such that it is like this. The synoptic problem, as proposed, this is a theory. How do we solve the synoptic problem? In this way. Gospel of Mark as the first, copied by Matthew and Luke, and they also have a common source, the Q, and Matthew has his own sources or maybe own compositions, that is M. Luke has a special source or own composition, and that is L. Okay, so that is a solution, a proposed solution to the synoptic problem. Okay, now I took this as the part of the Matthew Mark discourse or lesson that we have together. I have intended to introduce already Matthew and Mark in this first day, but it would do better. I would do better if that will be all for the next week, and that is an R for Matthew and then an R for Mark. And as you would note now, the proper order as biblical scholars, Mark and Matthew. But just to give you this assignment, and my assignment also is for you to read both Gospels, Mark and Matthew. Begin with Mark and then followed by Matthew. And look at another assignment is to look at these three. Of course, I will not be grading this, no? You do this on your own. Look at, for example, Mark 2, Matthew 9, and Luke 5. Okay, the call of Levi or Matthew, and compare them. What would you say? Okay, and these are other possibilities. Compare Mark 1, 29 to 31 with Mark 8, Matthew 8, 14 to 15, and Luke 4, 38 to 39, and so on, all the others. So there, I leave that with you, and I'll see you in our lesson Saturday, that is 8:30 to 10, to discuss this introduction to the New Testament and introduction to the Gospels. Thank you very much, and God bless you.